What's going on, 30MJers? I am here with head coaches Brad Loomis and Jeff Alberts, and today we're going to be talking about all things rest. That's right, rest between sets, rest between exercises, potentially rest between sessions in the same day if you're one of those crazy folks who is interested in two-a-day training, or maybe it just works out with your schedule. And then, of course, rest between days. And this is an area that has a lot of practical wisdom you can take from, as bodybuilders have experimented with everything from full body training to splits to even the Arthur Jones days, only training one muscle group like every fortnight and everything in between. Jeff has played around with this personally, and we've coached, and these guys have especially coached, literally hundreds of people with varying different approaches to this. And also, there's some cool research that's come out recently that independently is interesting, but when you look at it together, really starts to help us understand when and why you might want to use different types of rest paradigms. Some people get confused when they read about, hey, you need to rest long enough to recover to make your next set effective. Oh, but by the way, drop sets are great when you don't rest at all, and have trouble reconciling those two things. So we're going to get into all of that today. But first, I want to start with going to you, Jeff. When it comes down to thinking about, we'll start big picture, then we'll get small, how many days per week someone's going to train and how much rest they get between sessions, what are the first things that you need to find out from your client to establish kind of their weekly frequency and how much rest they get between training muscle groups?
I'm more of the practical guy. So the questions I'm going to ask somebody is like, how many days can you train per week where it's not going to negatively impact life outside the gym? Because once I figure out if it's 4 days, 5 or 6 or what have you, then I know when they're actually in the gym, it's going to be high quality. They're not going to be stressing on, hey, I got stuff to do outside of this. So while you're in the gym, I want the quality to be super high. I want you to be super efficient. And also want you to be efficient when you're out of the gym as well. Low stress.
Brad, anything that you do differently than that?
No, not really now. I used to. I back in the day, we always talk about how if we were to change things back then from what we know now, we would do things a lot different. And I remember back in the day, it was like, okay, this is what I feel is optimal right now. You figure out how to make this happen. And then was wondering why people started to hate their training and that their, performance kind of started to decline. And it wasn't until I kind of just came to the realization, more so for myself, is that mindset has a lot to do with performance. And the happier I was training, the more motivated I was training, not having all these other things that were kind of optimal, but I disliked them in my way, my performance went up. And so then that's when I started taking the approach that Jeff started just talking about. Start talking about practicality. How long can you spend in the gym? Okay, well, if that's the constraint, we got to think about doing supersets and drop sets and things like that. And it just kind of, it very much opened up the toolbox. And so that's a long, convoluted answer to now Brad pretty much does what Jeff does.
I don't think it was convoluted at all, Brad. I think it was very clear. And I think it's something a lot of people can relate to. I also program the same way. I start with a conversation of how often can you get to the gym, or your home gym, or which gym? What do you have equipment access to? What are the time constraints you have on those individual sessions? And then from there, I look at, okay, then what are the volumes that we could do? What are the volumes that could have worked for you previously? And then I will go to decisions based upon, okay, so you are time restricted, but we think that a level of work for your goals right now is maybe a bit more than you can do. Now I'm going to consider things like antagonist, agonist paired sets, or peripheral agonist supersets, or drop sets or rest pause to fit things in. And just like you, I think early on in my own personal training, and fortunately I fixed that before I became like a full-time bodybuilding coach. And I think many people in the quote unquote kind of evidence-based community, they look towards what they believe is optimal first, sacrificing what's practical. And this is a great example of when optimal is not optimal. And ironically, as I've become more and more aware of the research, I've came to understand I've come to understand, just how broad the guidelines for what can be effective for hypertrophy are. And it's actually been more freeing, not more restricting. And I think that's something that is a pretty consistent finding, is that we have a lot of tools that we can use in the tool belt. So if you think you're being super evidence-based optimal and it's leading you down a very, very narrow path that is conflicting with your life goals, I have a pretty big hunch as someone who's been involved in the research for more than a decade and involved in lifting for 2 decades that I think you're probably not quite as optimal as you think you are, which backs up both of your guys' approaches. Now for our first research tidbit, supporting the practices of the 3D&J coaching style. If we go back a little bit, like an interesting thing is there haven't been any major paradigm shifts in our understanding of exercise science, but there has been this really useful refinement that has resulted in tangible evolution in how we program. So if we went back, say, almost 10 years ago, we had a meta-analysis by Schoenfeld that found, hey, slightly better outcomes come from higher frequency training. And around this time, we were going, hey, you got to train muscle groups at least twice per week. But then, updated meta-analysis, more research is done, exploring different frequencies, and also teasing out why higher frequency training did result in better hypertrophy. 2019, Schoenfeld, Gurgic, and I think a few other authors, they put out how many times should a muscle be trained per week, and they did both a volume equated analysis and non-volume equated analysis. And overall, while frequency was better for hypertrophy, when they did the sub-analysis where they equated volume, this effect was no longer significant. And they found that frequencies between 1 to 3 or 4 times per week, predominantly in that 1 to 3 times per week, that's what's been studied, but some even higher, 4 or even 5 times, were the same, or there was no significant difference between them when volume was equated. And when you look at the volumes that were done, anywhere from like 3 to 15 sets per muscle group, so what we would describe as like a low to moderately high volume. So in kind of your quote unquote typical or low to moderate volume ranges, it seems like you can distribute it really however you want. And that's a great piece of information because now it supports that practical approach that we all take where we go, right, okay, are we operating in the realm of something that's pretty reasonable to do? Okay, we got 3 days, we got 4 days, we got 5 days, we got 2 days. No worries. Now, how much time do you have for each one of those days? How do I fit that in? And it becomes a constraint-led approach based upon the knowledge we have that we have a lot of flexibility. So I think that's really cool. And it's one of those instances where more data became more freeing, not more restrictive. So we now we're looking at, okay, it makes a lot of sense to start with what you can do, what you have access to, and what are your needs. A needs-led, constraint-based approach, if we want to sound all fancy. But moving on from there, when we start thinking about rest intervals and rest between sets, what are some of the general heuristics that you guys use, and what do you tell your clients? How do you have this actually play out when it comes to communicating the program to your athletes?
Yeah, and this is where I'm kind of eager to hear what you have to say, because I've had a long history of epiphanies, I guess you might say. And there was a point in time when I was a little too performance driven, and I wanted to do everything I could in a session to maximize each set. So I was actually pretty particular. I want you to rest a minimum of 2 minutes between your sets so that you could at least get 90% of your recovery ability back so that you can maximally perform on the next one. But likewise, I don't want you resting more than about 3.5 or 4 minutes because I don't want you cooling down, losing, just getting rust start to accumulate on that movement, right? And through practical programming, I kind of found out sometimes you can't get all those other important check marks, those check boxes marked off, while making sure that you're getting enough rest to be able to perform on each of your subsequent sets. And so then I started to get creative, and kind of doing things so that we could get the rest that we needed and kind of more, not thinking so much about performance. And then come to find out, now it's kind of like, well, performance is a pretty good proxy, but is it really needed for hypertrophy, right? I mean, it's kind of a nice thing to be able to see because it's motivating, but at the same time, we're kind of finding out it's really that effort that needs to happen there, right? And making sure that we're working in close to the proximity of failure and things like that. So then I kind of we're starting to get, like you said, Eric, it was kind of freeing. It's like, okay, what can we do now in order to get this time constraint and things like that, the practicality portion of it, and get those more important boxes, kind of checked off. So yeah, long story short, I'm eager to hear about rest periods and, kind of put my student cap on here and listen to what things, kind of have transpired since. But fast forward, now I'm kind of more thinking to myself, okay, now let's do what we can to get the effort that's needed in there, to get those money repetitions, get in that sweet spot, which has been, like I said, kind of like you said, a freeing thing, kind of figuring out that's the real goal, not can we sustain our performance on each and every single set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so all right. So Jeff, Brad said he's ready to put his student hat on. Are you ready?
I mean, well, I'm not dumb. I know you're the smart one here, so I'm gonna listen to what you have to say. But I think just the way I kind of see things too, it's like, how much effort are you putting into a set? Like, if it's a hard set, I mean, common sense is going to dictate you're going to be more winded. You might need some recovery. Because I'm thinking from a skill component, whether I'm resting 30 seconds or I'm resting 4 minutes, whatever it takes, when I go into another set, I want to make sure that I'm able to perform at my highest level. And also, too, as a coach, I come across a lot of different personalities. So, like, for me personally, like, I'm not a fan of supersetting because I like straight sets better. It's like from an enjoyment standpoint. So I know I'm going to get more out of myself with just doing straight sets versus like doing a bunch of supersets. Not to say that supersets aren't effective. It's just, for me, it's probably be more effective if I do something I'm going to actually enjoy. So questions, like one of the questions with programming with athletes is from that perspective. Like what's been your training history with using these things, straight sets, supersets, those types of things. And and some people's personalities too are just, they're fast-paced people. They can't sit, like even if they're winded, they don't want to stop moving. They just want to keep going. So am I going to have someone sit there for 4 minutes when I feel like maybe they need that rest to perform better? I'm like, hey, maybe 2 minutes in, just go for it. So even if they don't get another rep or two, at least they're still motivated there to keep themselves going as long as they're being safe.
I love it, Jeff, because I think ultimately, like I described, the way to view some of this information is as filling out your tool belt. And when you have athletes with different personalities, needs, demands, time restrictions, schedules, and equipment availability, or sometimes, working in their own personal gym or in a busy commercial gym at peak hours, all of those things come into play and are going to be the constraints much more so than what is quote unquote optimal. And indeed, there is almost never a singular optimal. Rather, it is, how do I take that information, those critical key pieces, and how do I use the tools available to me to get the best combination of those things, right? And I think something that you talk about a lot, composure, and to some degree, what I would describe as like bodybuilding performance, not necessarily what was the load or the reps, but am I able to keep composure? Can I push this set close to failure, targeting the right muscle groups, and making my final reps still look pretty damn similar to my initial ones, just slower, and really kind of, as Berto would say, hold that muscle to the fire. And some of these systems, which seem to work better or similar on paper, for some people, if they don't have the ability to maintain composure or the experience to do so, or maybe even just the cardiorespiratory conditioning, it could be not providing as much of a benefit as it might on paper. And so I think that context that you just provided is great before I get into some of these kind of more theoretical ideas. So I think, again, just like our understanding of frequency evolved and resulted in more nuanced and more effective programming and more flexibility, the same thing is true of rest intervals. So we had a few studies that came out back in the day in an eventual systematic review which generally advise towards, hey, rest longer, or even auto-regulate your rest. This is a second systematic review until you're ready to perform again, because what you don't want to do is lose volume or produce cardiorespiratory fatigue. Now, all that is true, but we also have to think about in what context. So I think there's a really cool study that was done relatively recently by Longo and colleagues that I think illustrates this quite well. And they had a number of different groups just doing leg extensions to failure with 80% of 1 RM. They had one group that was doing 3 sets to failure, and they had 3 minutes rest between sets. They had another group that was doing 3 sets to failure, which is 1 minute of rest between sets. But then they had 2 really other important groups, which helps to answer this question. Another group that did 3 minutes to failure with 1 minute of rest between sets, but then they would continue on to doing additional sets with 1 minute rest if they did not reach the volume load that was produced in that 3 minute rest interval condition, the other group. So basically, they were restricted to 1 minute rest, but they matched the volume load, the total sets times reps times load that the 3 minute rest group kept. So they got to the same place in terms of the work, and they both were training to failure, but they just had to only get to rest 1 minute between getting those reps, if that makes sense to you guys. So it was a volume matched group with less rest.
So more sets, in a sense.
Exactly. In a sense. It'd be like doing, maybe 6 sets to failure with 1 minute rest to get to the same place that other group did over 3 sets with 3 minute rest.
Gotcha.
And then to really tease out this question to make sure the interaction between total volume and rest intervals was answered, they also had another group that did 3 minutes rest, but they stopped doing sets once they reached the same amount of volume as the group that only did 1 minute. So they might have only done like 2 sets and then stopped that set halfway through. But again, we had a matched group with more rest to a matched group with less rest, and then we had a matched group with less rest to a matched group with more or less in terms of volume. And the really interesting thing is that the 2 groups that did more volume, that is resting 3 minutes between all 3 sets, or the group that did 1 minute rest and essentially did more sets to equate that volume group, they had almost twice the hypertrophy as well as 40% higher total volume load than the other 2 groups that had a restricted rest interval and therefore lower volume. So what this essentially tells us is that work does matter to some degree, what you're actually physically performing, as does training to failure, because all the groups did, or training close enough, right, if we're talking about the practicality. But there's 2 components here. How much total muscular work are you doing? And then what is the quality of that work? Which isn't anything new, but it helps us understand what's going on here. And then we can start to go, okay, well, that means that if I can save time, but still produce the same amount of work or greater work and still have that high level of effort, like you were saying, Brad, then that's a time efficiency win. Now, in this specific example, however, it was about a wash. The amount of hypertrophy versus the amount of time spent, how much they had to do extra, it got you to about the same place. There wasn't much of a time efficiency saving. So that means that basically 1 minute rest is too fatiguing. You're not gaining anything. You're not recovering enough to get that sweet spot where you're able to do more work than if you'd rested longer. And we can see in the real world, this is going to play out on an individual basis. If you've got an athlete with a background in CrossFit or endurance work, or they're just in great shape for whatever reason, the rest that the recovery they're going to get from, say, 1 minute or 2 minutes rest is going to be substantially more than someone else who is just maybe very sedentary outside of their training, or doesn't have a high training volume background, or just different physiological characteristics, right? So that's also been shown in other research. Like, instead of just comparing one rest interval versus another, there have been studies by DeSalle, I believe, where they dropped off 30 seconds each week and eventually got down to what we would consider a pretty short rest interval by the end of the study, but had similar hypertrophy to another group that just rested longer the whole time. So you can certainly adapt to working at a faster pace.
Get more conditioned.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, not everything has to be a trade-off, though. And you were talking about supersets, Jeff. One of my favorite techniques that has now actually got a couple of studies recently published, not just looking at how much volume did you do acutely in a given session, but did you actually have the same amount of hypertrophy over time, is the agonist-antagonist superset or antagonist paired sets. And this is the idea that you're just letting the muscle group that is the opposite of what you're training, basically while you're resting, get to perform. So you do a set of bench, you do a set of rows, and then you rest. And I think in the real world, you just take as much rest as you need between the two, but you're doing alternating sets, and you just go when you're ready. Now, you're essentially trading less cardiorespiratory rest for the same amount of muscular rest when you think about it, right? If I do bench and I rest 2 minutes, and I do row and I rest 2 minutes, I've got 2 minutes of rest, right? But if I do bench and then row and then rest 2 minutes, I still do, but I also have that transition time before I bench again. If I did bench, I only get the 2 minutes. And this research has consistently shown similar or more volume. And now we actually have a couple studies that show the same hypertrophy over time, which is really cool. And a savings in the recent study by Burke that's pre-printed by about like 1/3. So you can complete, a 60-minute workout if you're using antagonist paired sets in 40 minutes by doing something like this. And I think a lot of us program like our upper body sessions this way. Like, you do chest back, 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 shoulders back, shoulders back, shoulders back, etc. So
now in the real world, let's just pause you there. In the real world, like some commercial gyms, it's just hard for people to maneuver with that.
100%.
There's people are on the equipment. So in that case, I'm just like, hey, it is what it is. Like, you get the proper rest, go to the next exercise and move on. So, I mean, in my situation personally, like home gym, it makes a lot of sense. And a busy commercial gym might not make too much sense. So from that perspective, like how much would you say is the benefit? Like if you were to compare, like, hey, I'm doing I'm going to go flat press. Now I'm going to go to an incline press versus going flat to a row. Like what would be the difference in hypertrophy between those two over the long run? If you had to put a percentage on it.
It's going to be the same. That is the main benefit between antagonist agonist paired sets, or a related concept, peripheral agonist paired sets, which is basically training something that's unrelated but not the antagonist, like calf raises between your sets of bicep curls, is purely time saving. And so this can be really, really helpful for someone like me, where I'm trying to accomplish a lot of volume, but I'm also quite busy. And I actually do train in the AUT gym. And like just literally yesterday, this is perfect timing that you brought this up, Jeff. I had to go train at peak hours. I got there at 4 p.m. and at 4:10. And I was like, this is not ideal. Normally I'm training at 3. It's 2 hours or an hour and a half before everybody gets there. And I can be the jerk who's hogging equipment, because sometimes I'm literally one of 3 people in the gym. Especially if it's like off semester, because it's a university gym. But anyway, I just had to get creative. So I was doing, for example, my limbs day. It's my legs and my arms. It's actually a really hard day. It's 9 total exercises. And to get through it in less than an hour and a half, I do a lot of antagonist paired sets and a lot of peripheral agonist supersets. And I had to change up what the plan was. So what I did was, while I was doing my Smith machine squats, I would then go over and do calves on a vacant leg press, a machine leg press that nobody likes. And I understand why, because it's really only good for calf raises, in my opinion, because of the range of motion. So that was fine. That one worked out, right? Then I grabbed a dumbbell and I brought it over back to the Smith machine, because after Smith machine wedge squats, I do good mornings. And I'm not sharing the Smith machine with anybody. I'm just sitting there doing squats, resting, and going again, straight sets. But I was doing my single arm elbow extensions that I was going to do later in the session paired with biceps, because I was like, well, hold on. I can do the biceps with another exercise. And then when I went to do my leg press, single leg high stance leg press, you know what? If you scoot up a little bit on the leg press, you can do incline dumbbell curls on there. And that's actually what I had planned anyway. So if someone looks at my story right now, well, not right now, because this is going to come out later, but if you two gentlemen were to look at my story right now, you would see me going from leg press to bicep curls. And that's where the lesson is that you can grab a pair of dumbbells and take them over to a machine or a station. And even in a busy gym setting, you can not be a jerk, and you can get in some pretty useful peripheral paired supersets, or potentially agonist-antagonist supersets. Like, go over to a lat pull down, you turn around, you put your back against the thing that holds your legs in place, and now you can do dumbbell press along with lat pull down. You can also bring some dumbbells over to, you're doing your incline dumbbell press, then you do chest supported dumbbell rows, and you're only using one piece of equipment. You might have to take up 2 pairs of dumbbells, but typically that's much less of an issue, even in a busy commercial setting. So I think it comes down to creativity, and it comes down to understanding what are good pairings. But I think you don't need to do antagonist paired supersets. It's really it's based upon the constraints. So going back to, we'll take a step back. Okay, we've set up our program. Someone can train 3 days per week for an hour, and maybe they got a new job, but they want to compete at a pro show. They turned pro last season, and they're like, "Hey, how do I do this? You know what? I don't think I can make this work." And Jeff goes, "No, I got you. In this hour, I can actually get an hour and 20 minutes of work for you done if we're creative. And here's how you would do that in the gym if we need to, right?" Because, some people are just not going to be in the perfect position to where they could do straight sets and accomplish the level of work that they might want to do. So I think things like that are really where these tools come into play.
From a performance perspective.
Great question. So a really interesting finding.
Because, we've always, hey, we got to push the loads or we got to push the reps. I've been someone who's said that in the past, but I also know, if we remove, we scratched off all the numbers on the barbells and dumbbells, as long as we're hitting the appropriate proximity to failures, you're going to get a stimulus regardless. So, for someone who's concerned about the performance aspect and they're being creative like this, and, maybe your workouts are changing every session or every week, it's something different. How big of a concern would that be? If at all?
No, that's a great question. And actually, there's some really useful findings from these recent 2 studies, because the one by Burke, they didn't see any reduction in performance, very similar volume loads between the 2 groups. But I would describe it as they had a program that was really set up to show the benefits of supersets. So they had a chest press row pairing. They had a bicep curl tricep push down pairing. I think they had incline lat pull down or incline row. I don't have it right in front of me. I can't remember. They had bicep tricep, and then they had leg extension leg curl. None of those are huge, big compound lifts that are going to put a lot of stress through you, and it's just 6 exercises. So similar volume, similar outcomes. However, the session RPE, so how hard was the overall session, was about 1 point higher. Although the average, that was and they did a very early part of the study where they just had everyone in the study try both sessions and see which one was harder. And there was about a 1 point difference. So that's basically representing the higher cardiorespiratory demand of just having less total rest in the session, even though each muscle is still getting to rest sufficiently. You have to consider the cardiovascular demand. So if you're not in sufficient cardiorespiratory shape, it certainly could affect performance. But this is where it comes down to structuring it well, and you will adapt over time. But Iverson and colleagues also did a study, and they used a mixture of agonist-antagonist paired sets as well as peripheral agonist paired sets. So they had a leg press in there, and they also had some other exercises. And one interesting thing is that the 2 exercises which were always at the end of the training, they had an A-B setup, a seated row, and then also a lat pull down. Those 2 specific exercises, which occurred at the end of the workout, including an agonist peripheral superset with leg press, those 2 actually had poorer strength gains and lower volume in the group that was doing supersets. And I think, over time, that could potentially result in poor hypertrophy, because while we do care about perceived effort, we want to make sure that the effort and the proximity to failure is real, that it's actually muscular fatigue, that we are unable to produce more reps, not just I'm pooped because I just had to superset lat pull down and leg press, and now you got me going over to, seated row and something else. So I think you do need to be very careful about what level of cardiorespiratory conditioning is the client in, and then what are you supersetting? Because when you start doing things like the example I gave, good morning supersetted with tricep raises, and then curl supersetted with leg press, I know I can do that because I have the training data to look back on it and know that my straight sets are fine. But if you took me 2 years ago when I was, or 3 years ago, deep into pure powerlifting training, and my step count was only 5,000 a day, that would have gassed me really bad, and it would have affected performance on pretty much the whole session. And I think in the long run, that probably could have caused issues until
What
I
if you
adapted.
just start at 1 set, though? Let's say you started at one set. Hey, let's start slow and just adapt this.
100%.
One set for a couple of weeks. We'll go 2 sets the next couple of weeks. Then you start picking up endurance.
Absolutely. And that is essentially some of the take homes that people should have from this is that, okay, again, like constraint-led approach. We can do this, but you need to be in sufficient cardiorespiratory shape, the equipment and the availability, all that stuff. So how do we get you there? And that's where the coaching magic comes in. All right, here's the destination of where I want to get you to at the end of this block, but I need to build you up to it. And I think that's a perfect application, Jeff.
Hey, 3DMJers, Andrea Valdez here, popping in with a quick announcement that we have just released our latest course in the 3DMJ Vault titled Macros into Meals, a practical guide to eating for lifters. This one was created by 2 of our head coaches, Brad Loomis and Jeff Alberts. And in it, they'll be teaching you how to create a full day of eating based on your calorie targets, macro targets, athletic goals, energy needs, and overall lifestyle. Macros into Meals is sort of the next nutritional step we wanted to add into the Vault VIP membership to be taken after our 3 other foundational dietary courses. So athletes can progress through these lessons by first taking nutrition fundamentals for lifters, then calculating your calories, then calculating your macros, and then finally this course, Macros into Meals. Our goal is to continue building upon previous lessons so that the Vault remains robust and continues to grow with athletes as they acquire more skills and progress through their careers. Macros into Meals is now the 27th course in the 3DMJ Vault, which is our online learning platform of organized video-based education for serious lifters. You can get all access to all courses with a one-time purchase of a lifetime VIP membership or a one-time purchase of a single-year VIP membership. Either way, as of 2024, this is not a recurring subscription any longer. You choose your single purchase option and you get to see everything for a year or for life. You'll get foundational training courses also, like personalizing your program, bodybuilding program design, and the lifting library. And you'll also get more specific accessory courses for training and nutrition, like the Advanced Deload Guide, Transitioning Away from Tracking, the Godfather's Guide to Posing, the Lagging Body Parts course, the Physique Photo Guide, and more. Head on over to 3dmjvault.com and sign yourself up for a VIP membership today. That's 3dmjvault.com to get all access. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the show.
You know, speaking of powerlifting training, I want to kind of pivot this to, you know, our strength, our strength focused brethren, and also pivot this in terms of these rest periods that we're talking about. At first, we started about kind of long-term rest, and now we're in between sets. But I want to kind of start talking about like performance and like double days, right? And for a little bit of context behind this, you know, a lot of my power lifters, and you experience this as well as a lot of us do, you work up to a heavy single on something, do your back down sets, then you got to break it all down. You got to do that again for bench press, you know, or bench press and deadlift, etc. One thing that using the creativity is we started basically splitting into double days, right? And Jeff, I know you've kind of used double days in some of your training here recently, more so for you know, family-based needs. But one thing I found out is that we were able, you know, to get that same amount of work in, but we just had 2 shorter periods. We had, you know, our squat work and maybe an accessory movement in the AM, and then we did the bench work and an accessory movement in the PM, or deadlift, bench, you know, kind of what have you, right? But, you know, of course, as an unintended consequence, but you can kind of see the writing on the wall. What happens? You know, performance ends up shooting up because you're not as pooped when you move to the bench press after doing the squat, or you move to the deadlift after doing a bench press, right? And so obviously we don't want to do this all the way up to the powerlifting meet, because now we're not in the environment that we're going to be in when we're actually competing. So at some point, you know, we have to kind of start putting these things together. But, you know, all of this context just kind of is, I guess, more so directed toward, you know, a question toward you, Eric. You know, do we have any evidence on double days and how they affect. Obviously, strength is going to be, a big outcome, and performance of our strength is going to be a big outcome. But kind of more so long term, what do we find from this? And then also, for our bodybuilders out there, what are the outcomes as far as hypertrophy goes as well?
Yeah, we actually do have a handful of studies on this, and the outcome that is relatively consistently reported, and this has been done actually in pretty high-level strength athletes, some Olympic lifters, is that when you take the same work and you split it up into 2 daily sessions, you tend to get better performance in those sessions, strength performance.
Which makes sense.
And this can result in long-term better strength adaptation. To take it back to Jeff's point about the constraints, though, I think this is really something that, because just because how long it takes to warm up to a heavy squat, like when you have a strong, reasonably experienced powerlifter doing even moderate volumes for what we consider moderate volume in powerlifting, I think this becomes something that is almost completely off the table, except for maybe like students with a lot of time, people with home gyms, or people who are within a walking distance to a gym. I have played with this stuff, but downstairs I have a gym, if I, like, for example, I mentioned I had to train yesterday and I got there at 4:10. I left my house at 3:30. So there was 40 minutes of traffic. If I had to do that twice in the same day, now all of a sudden it's trading too much time efficiency. Like, I just couldn't do that, even if it was theoretically better. I have played with it at home, but I think that's kind of one of those things where in my mind, as a coach, the first question would be, is that even on the table? I'd want to determine that to see if it was potentially beneficial. But there is a rationale for why it might be helpful, because there is other research on these peripheral agonist supersets where, kind of semi-similar to Shaiko, but not exactly the same because they don't use supersets. They just do, bench, squat, bench sometimes in the same session. When you include squats pretty consistently in a superset with, like, say, bench and barbell row or chest supported barbell row, like seal rows, you see squat performance can suffer. You can see like slightly lower velocity, or if you're training closer to failure, a little bit lower volume. And I personally, and I know you probably agree with this, Brad, we very much see the lifts as skills. Yes, you need to get bigger muscles. Yes, you need to kind of quote unquote have raw strength, but skill development and motor learning and being attentive and present while squatting, benching, and deadlifting is a key thing that I want a powerlifter to do, even if they're just doing like doubles at 80%. Like if it's an easy quote unquote strength or power or technique day, I don't want them to be thinking about, I need to go from this directly to bench, set that up, then go to my row. Because maybe some people can maintain presence and focus on the lift they're doing, but I find you tend to be more in kind of like a moving flow when you're doing an agonist peripheral supersets. And I don't want you doing that. I want you to be present with your squat. Because the argument that I have seen people make is, look, if it's just a double with 80%, that's fine. I can superset that with bench. And I'm like, yes, you can, but are you respecting those 2 reps on squat and bench? And if you are, fair enough. But I know personally, it's a little harder for me to treat a given movement with the respect and the intentiveness and the focus that I want to treat it with what I'm starting to include it in kind of a rotation. So I just think, yes, there's evidence to suggest you might want to split up that training and you could benefit from it based upon the 2-day research. And yes, there's evidence that when you pack a lot of work in with antagonist peripheral sets from bench and squat, that especially the big compound lift can suffer in terms of performance a bit, a very small amount to be clear. But do you have the constraints to do that? And should you be even considering supersetting in the first place? Like there's always like, for every gimme, there's a gotcha. There's always a trade-off, So anytime we're considering a time-efficient strategy, we are paying some expense for it. And sometimes the expense doesn't make sense, and sometimes it does. So, for example, the expense of doing, say, a agonist superset, where I do flies and then bench press, is going to increase my perceived exertion locally and cardiovascularly, just like any type of superset would. And it's also going to drop my mechanical performance because now I'm basically doing an extended set, right? So if you take 3 sets of bench and then 3 sets of flies, and you were to do them with 2 minutes of rest between every single one, or you did bench fly, bench fly, bench fly, you would probably have an elevated RPE and less total volume, and you'd probably get a worse outcome, right? So that trade-off just simply doesn't make sense. You finished the workout earlier, but you probably got a fraction of the hypertrophy, maybe 60%, something like that if I had to put a number to it. You can eliminate part of that negative trade-off by doing bench row, bench row, bench row, and then, fly, rear delt later. And the only thing that you're getting is that increased perceived exertion from the cardiorespiratory demand. And so long as you're in sufficient shape, cool. You cut your workout into 2/3 of its normal length, didn't sacrifice volume, you were able to train close to failure. It's a win-win if you're in sufficient shape. And there's many options like that. When we look at the drop set research, which we'll probably talk about, we look at rest pause research, which we'll probably talk about. And then we take a step back to 2-a-day sessions, again, same thing. Is it worth it to try to preserve that performance when you have to drive 40 minutes to the gym twice? Or maybe you're only a 5-minute walk from the gym and you need to get your step count up anyway. And you're like, actually, this is great. I've got another 10 minutes of steps. That's another 2,000. Okay, great. And I'm learning from this podcast because you're listening to the 3DMJ podcast.
No, I enjoyed 2-a-days when I was doing it. And even with the home gym, I was like, okay, I did this for, I think it was maybe 3 or 4 months, Brad, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. And yeah, like Brad was saying, my performance went up because my focus was really high because I was only doing minimal work per session. Like in the morning, I would do 1 or 2 smaller isolation type exercises. And I just made sure that it wouldn't overlap with anything I was doing in the evening. And it was usually a bigger lift, like 1, 2, 3 bigger lifts in the evening session. And all my lifts were just going up. Just strength was going up. Hypertrophy, I don't know. I mean, I've been training for a long time, so I highly doubt that. But it was fun to see performance actually go up. But then life kind of happens. It's like, well, I don't have the time to do that anymore. So now it's going to be more of a stressor trying to force that in there. And this is someone with a home gym. So someone who's commuting to work or what have you, it's like, yeah, that's a no-go. Like I won't even attempt to give someone that to somebody. Another good example of where you can see, so like, all right, so I described how chest superset, probably not a good idea because you finish earlier, but it's worse. You could make the argument, well, what if I just do more supersets, Eric? And that's basically more or less a drop set, right? When you think about it. And drop sets are really interesting. And I think we need to understand why they can be effective and in what context. Now, if we just take a second and think about it, how long does it take to do 3 sets of bicep curls if we rest, say, 90 seconds, 2 minutes? Probably 6-7 minutes, something like that?
Barely over 5, yeah.
Yeah, right. Now, what if I just did 1 set and then I did 3 drops, immediately reducing load by 20%, and then immediately banging out as many reps as I can get, knowing I'll probably get a few less reps, but because I dropped the load 20%. Now we're talking 2 minutes maybe? I mean, how long is that extended set going to last, right? Maybe we go like 10, drop 20%, get 6, 7, and then 8, so maybe 2 minutes. Like it's basically like doing a set of 20-ish, 25. That's a tremendous amount of time savings, right? This is where we can potentially leverage the time efficiency to make up for the loss of per set stimulus, okay? And this is really cool. So now we actually have 2 meta-analyses, folks, that have recently come out. They're so recent they're actually meta-analyzing the same studies. There's just 6 in one and 5 in the other, so it's actually not a huge body of research, but it sounds impressive when you say 2 meta-analyses. But anyway, we've got these 2 meta-analyses of the drop set research. And what they find is that when you compare head-to-head protocols, drop set versus traditional set, you get equivalent hypertrophy on average when you look at the standardized effect. However, if you add up the number of sets, including drops and the first set that were done in the drop set groups versus the straight set groups, to get to the equivalent of 10 straight sets, they had to do 13 drop sets. So the obvious thing here, the trade-off is you're losing the per set stimulus, right? It's about, what is that, 22% less effective or something like that. I don't know. But basically you would have to do 13 drop sets, counting initial sets and drops, to have the equivalent of 10 sets. So that's like about 77%. I think I did the math. And if we wanted to create a spreadsheet to count the volume on drop sets equivalent to straight sets, you can do that now, which is cool. And you might think, oh, then why would I do that? I don't. That's less efficient. Nah, because you can literally finish those drop sets in more time, in less time than it takes to get to those straight sets.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're trading per set stimulus for time efficiency. And you can go, okay, well, how about I just accept the fact that I need to do essentially an extra set. Instead of doing 3 straight sets, anytime I do an isolation movement at the end of my session, I do 1 straight set and then 4 drop sets. What are you gaining? You're gaining about, in this example, or 5 minutes versus 1 minute, you're gaining about 4 minutes on that exercise for the same stimulus. But you have to feel like you're working a little harder, and you have to be comfortable and like the fact that you're, pushing a set to failure. Now, me personally, if we're talking bicep curls, tricep pushdowns, lateral raises, the pump's better. I feel like a badass. I'm enjoying working that hard. That's just me personally. And I've saved myself 4 minutes. And if I do that across multiple exercises on multiple days, for me, when I look at my training protocol, the drop sets that I do and the rest pause, which is a similar concept, it saves me about an hour per week, believe it or not.
That was my question for you, is because the drop sets, it's technically we're dropping the load down.
Yes.
Okay. So Myo-reps, we're maintaining load.
Yes.
But reps come down.
Yes.
So what would be the difference between a drop set and a Myo-rep as far as the effectiveness between those two?
Great question. Now, I will clarify that, Myo-reps, shout out Umberge Fagerli, who originally developed these. He doesn't do these exactly. Well, they haven't really been researched much besides one conference preprint, but we do have a fair amount of data on rest pause. And rest pause is a little different because Myo-reps typically you're training close to, but not actually to failure. And rest pause, what they do is they train to failure, and then you rest about 20 seconds and you do it again. Mm-hmm. And then you have a set number of rest pauses or a cutoff when you can't get a certain number of reps.
With about the same load, correct?
Exactly, same load.
Okay.
Load doesn't change. So let's say you get 80% on 1RM, you do 8 reps to failure, right? Rest 20 seconds, bang out another 3, rest 20 seconds, bang out another 3, rest 20 seconds, bang out another 3.
Yep.
We don't have a meta-analysis on rest pause, but the handful of studies we do have suggests that when you reach the same amount of volume, it's equivalent to doing straight sets, but it is faster. So it's similar to we think about it from a physics perspective. You're dropping weight and you get similar number of reps or close-ish. Let's say you got 10 with 80 pounds, or let's say, 100 pounds on curls, you do 10 reps. You drop down to 80, you get 8 or 9 reps, and you drop 20% each time. Reps aren't dropping precipitously, but they are coming down for most people a little bit. You're producing less force because you're using less load and you're not getting as many reps. It's just physics. There's less work being done because your muscles are fatigued. Not every motor unit is being able to turn on and recruit those fibers. So those sets, by definition, are probably a little bit less effective. And you can make the argument that you're pushing past fatigue. You're making sure that they're receiving a high stimulus. But ultimately, we see that you got to do 13 sets to equal 10. So we know that the per set stimulus is lower, and it would probably be a very similar outcome for rest pause. And you would have to figure out, we'd have to do research to figure out what's the equivalent number of rest pauses to get to straight sets. But one thing is that I would expect rest pause to produce slightly better strength adaptations because the average load would be maintained higher.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah.
But I don't think you should be using rest pause for strength, at least not training to failure. That would now we're transitioning to cluster sets, which is fine because now you're stopping short of failure and you're just kind of banging out reps with a given load to maintain velocity and performance and the mechanical outcome, like talking about physics. And I think that is a potentially viable way of going, and we have data on that for strength outcomes. But for hypertrophy, I think it's really just a practical concern. So, for example, if I'm doing cable lateral raises and I do drop sets, most time, I'm only a couple of, I'm maybe on 20, 30 pounds. And if I drop it 3 times, I'm just doing the cable itself.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I will often do rest pause on cable lateral raises or a mixture. I'll drop once and then I'll do rest pause and I'll drop again and I'll do rest pause. And that's because I understand the overall principle that if I get to a similar amount of mechanical work and I have a similar average proximity to failure, and here's the caveat, which we'll talk about, I'm actually pretty sure that my proximity to failure is accurately gauged and not just me winded and not being able to sustain the discomfort that comes from
I was
a
going
high.
to say, it sounds like it just comes down to practicality and
Yes.
maybe skill level with an individual and what they actually enjoy doing better.
Yes. Yeah, you look at the mechanical performance, like, all right, am I getting a similar rough amount of work? And if we're counting sets, then you have to get more sets to offset that drop in work per set. And am I training with a high effort, still maintaining composure, targeting the right muscle group, and getting near failure? And if the answer is yes, and I save time, that was a win. If you're sacrificing those things, might not be worth it, or you just have to gauge that. So rest pause and drop sets, you're essentially higher RPE, higher perceived exertion, shorter time, but more efficient if you were thinking about the stimulus per unit of time than stimulus per set. And that's like kind of the second tier option after antagonist paired sets, because antagonist paired sets are peripheral paired sets. It's the same stimulus per unit of volume if you have the cardiorespiratory fatigue and saves time. Drop sets, rest pause, or just short rest intervals in general, it is only beneficial if you can get a greater stimulus per unit of time because you are accepting a loss in the stimulus per unit of volume, right? And the most recent meta-analysis that we have on rest periods, which actually just got published, indicates that it's right around 90 seconds of intraset rest on average across all these studies. It's probably going to be different based upon the person, the exercise, the experience level, how strong they are. But when we look at kind of all the data, bird's eye view, after you rest more than 90 seconds between exercises, that's when we stop seeing a really clear benefit of longer rest periods for hypertrophy. There's like marginal benefits. It's definitely leaning that direction. But that makes sense when we go back to these initial studies where we compare like 1 minute rest to 3 minutes rest. That's just way too short of a rest interval for it to be worthwhile. The per set stimulus is lower and it's so much fatigue that you don't end up saving time. But if you push that rest interval just up to around 90 seconds, 2 minutes, yeah, your performance is going to be worse, but you might be able, but it's not enough to really impact hypertrophy in the short term, and you might be able to pack in a little bit more work in a given unit of time. And you just have to decide whether that's worth it, whether the person likes that. And you also have to build them up to that conditioning level. And that can be done with just short rest intervals or no rest intervals and doing load reductions like in a drop set, or mini interset rests and doing more additional sets to get back to a similar volume and rest pause.
You talked a little bit about the mechanical load and the work that is needed in that muscle. It's piqued my curiosity and my interest on that because a lot of times I will have a little bit of pushback, especially more so from my strength related folks than my hypertrophy related folks, that reduction in load, you're getting less return because you're not making those you're not getting recruiting those fibers, from there. And so, yeah, I'm kind of curious, at least it sounds like it affects more so strength than it does hypertrophy. But I just want to make sure that I'm clear on it. It sounds like when you're talking about like pure hypertrophy over the long haul, that little bit of reduction in load, it doesn't sound like it really makes much of a difference. It just kind of comes out in the wash, for lack of a better term. Is that kind of what you were getting at? Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah. And I think to some degree we have to be, so there's two things. I'll talk a little bit about our best understanding of what's actually going on mechanically when we see changes in performance on the bar, or we're dropping reps or dropping load, and what fibers are being recruited and how and what. But I think more pragmatically, big picture is that if the effort level is there, that's going to absolutely kind of come out in the wash, like you said, at least in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
The important thing, though, is it is true that if there's a pretty large difference in the total amount of work that someone's doing, because they had to drop load or drop reps, even if they're feeling like it's very hard, it's not going to produce as much hypertrophy, because there is a component to just how much work is being done from a physics perspective. Now, shifting to physiology, we have to think about how muscles contract. Okay, so we have what's called the Henneman size principle. And this is the idea that we recruit motor units which innervate muscle fibers, which can produce more force and power in order of need. So we talked about this before. So like when you when you do a 1RM, everything is coming to the party. Every motor unit, even the postural support, slow twitch fibers, which, very not fatigable, they're helping, right now, me standing upright, a bunch of motor units that innervate slow twitch fibers in my back and my postural support muscles are active, and they can be active pretty much 24/7, except when I sleep, and they're not going to fatigue, they're fine. I'm not recruiting the same muscles or motor units and muscle fibers associated with them when I'm doing a set of rows with my 6-rep max, right? So those fibers are not recruited, but all of the slow twitch ones that are postural support are recruited. So it's everything in order as per needed. Now, when we're doing moderate or light load sets and we're training all the way to failure, eventually we get to a similar place of everything getting recruited. And our best theory of how that occurs is what's called motor unit cycling. So we have different motor units that are cycling in and out during that set as fatigue is happening and other motor units are unable to keep recruiting fibers. Because we also have what's called the all or nothing principle. A motor unit, because it is basically just an on or off switch with an action potential, it recruits all of the fibers and innervates completely or not at all. There's not really a graded response. The way we grade force production is whether or not all or somewhere between of the motor units are turned on. But when a motor unit is active, all the fibers are contracting maximally. So when you're producing less force, that means that some of those motor units are no longer active.
Yeah.
So that means that there is potentially, and this is where it gets a little fuzzy, less total tension being developed across all the fibers. And the reason I say it's fuzzy is because we do have structural proteins that connect between muscle fibers that distribute force laterally. So like even if there's a muscle fiber that's off somewhere, it may be experiencing some tension from the lateral force transmission. Mm-hmm. But if it's not active, is that as effective? Does that produce hypertrophy? That's quite a big question mark that no one has a clear answer to. And we do know that just simply stretching a muscle does produce hypertrophy. So probably something. So it's hard to say. But if you're unable to produce as much force, that means not as many muscle fibers are active and contracting, not as many motor units are turned on. And that probably means that despite the fact that you're perceiving a high level of effort, you may not necessarily, at least within that snapshot, be producing as much tension. But then again, you also got to that point of fatigue because you trained other muscle fibers and now they're unable to contribute.
Yeah.
So then it comes down to the question of what is the fatigue that we're experiencing, and is it facilitative or debilitative? So I know I've gone off on a bit of a tangent here, and I'm trying to bring it home for everybody.
I like it because you made me come up with another question for you.
Good.
That might be another tangent.
Oh, well, I'll close this loop, and then you give me another question, and I'll be happy to answer it.
I'm writing it down.
All right. So discomfort, negative affect, which is just kind of a proxy for how good or bad did something feel, and perceived exertion are higher when you do high rep sets to failure. And that's because there's a greater cardiovascular demand. There's more metabolic demand on the muscle. It produces more of that sensation of burning and pain. And also, we see that when we do reps for a given set higher than 12, our ability to gauge proximity to failure gets worse.
Yeah.
So when you are doing any of these time-saving techniques, there is the potential for you to think you're at failure when you're not. Yes. And you can
that's Brad at the end of a set.
And
He's getting
to be
panicked.
honest, Yes, exactly. And that's exactly the composure I was talking about earlier, is that when you start to use these techniques, you need to make sure that you can still maintain the target muscle being fatigued, right?
Yeah.
And you can see this externally as a coach. Like this is another reason why I film a lot of my sets. It's not just to produce Instagram story content and share my favorite hip hop songs on Instagram. It is also so that I can look at it and go like, did I keep composure? And my face makes faces, and I have like the Elvis dancing legs when I do chest press near failure. But the target muscles are there, and I'm able to maintain sufficient composure, but not always. There have been times where I've looked at it, I'm like, that was that a row?
little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Like, could that have been better if I had done that differently? Should I rested a little bit longer, et cetera? And I think that needs to be evaluated, because we understand that you don't need a study to say that doing 20 rep sets to failure are harder than 8 rep sets, right?
Yeah.
We don't need a study to say that leg extensions burn more than other movements because of the metabolic demand of you being flexed and cutting off blood flow, or BFR hurts more. We know things that hurt more, right? And when we do high reps, it's cardiovascularly fatiguing and it's burning. That kind of global sensation of fatigue can make it more difficult to go to true failure, because we're experiencing non-muscle related failure. Task failure occurs for other reasons, and we don't want that. So I think that is something, and I could get more complex on that. Like, there's metabolic fatigue can actually produce quote unquote central fatigue, where you're actually getting nervous system inhibition that is preventing you from actually recruiting those muscle fibers. It's not all just you wussed out because it hurt. That's part of it. You might be wussing out because it hurt, but you also might be unable to actually recruit all your muscle fibers because of that amount of fatigue that you're experiencing.
This is kind of tying into the question I had, because I was going to ask you about rest between reps. So has there been studies done, like actually people resting longer between reps, pauses, versus not doing that, like just going straight through?
Yes. So
what's the differences there?
Great question. So this is where cluster sets and rest redistribution comes into play. And the idea of a cluster set and rest redistribution is that you're taking, instead of between set rest, you're taking within set or between rep rest. And the purpose for this generally, and it's done with velocity-based training to gauge this and measure it, is to preserve the velocity of each repetition, right? I do 3 reps, I rest a bit, I do 3 reps, I rest a bit. That would be clustering or rest redistribution. Now, when you call it rest redistribution, it's because, let's say you're doing 3 sets of 10, and that takes you, let's say, 5 minutes. If you did 10 sets of 3, but still in 5 minutes, that would be an example of rest redistribution, or 30 sets of 1 with little rests, however you want to think of it. But the same total time, but just getting rest between reps versus sets, you see a slight increase in the velocity per rep, and you get better mechanical output in terms of velocity maintained throughout the whole set. And that actually seems to improve power adaptations. Makes sense, right? Because power is force times velocity. So if you can maintain a higher velocity, boom, boom. Now, cluster sets are basically saying, I'm willing to take longer to do that. That means I'm going to do 20 seconds of rest between each one of those reps, and I'm going to do 30 sets of 1, right? Now you see a slightly better improvement in power, but again, you got the trade-off that we always talk about, the gimme and the gotcha. The gotcha here is it takes even longer. Like, yeah, you can get more rest if you want to do everything in your power, ironically, pun intended, to preserve power and velocity, right? But there's a trade-off. Now, the funny thing is that when we look at this, and again, this is equated volume studies, Jeff, when you compare cluster sets versus straight sets or sets to failure or rest redistribution, when you're doing this and you're maintaining a higher velocity, which means you're training further from failure, there's a slight negative effect on hypertrophy. Because now we're taking the same volume, but training further from failure. And a lot of the times the loads used in these studies are moderate, like 70, 75%. Now, if when you look at the studies that are heavier loads, 80, 85%, that effect goes away. But again, going back to Henneman's size principle, when you're lifting heavy enough, and Robinson's recent meta-regression shows this as well, you're already close to failure. Like if you're choosing 85% of 1RM, you're only going to get, 5 to 7 reps.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't be at 8 RIR, right? That's not a thing, So that means that if you're doing a triple, you're automatically close to failure and you're exposing pretty much all of your muscle fibers to those 3 reps. So doing heavy work in this kind of cluster or rest pause nature probably wouldn't sacrifice the hypertrophy if you were to do straight sets. But when you're doing moderate load work, like if you do a triple at 70% of 1RM, you might be 15 reps from failure.
Yeah.
So instead of doing 3 by 15, if you did 15 by 3 and you preserved this, 8 to 12 RIR on all of those reps, you're never actually exposing the muscle fibers to high tension, and it does harm hypertrophy a bit.
What about on a leg extension? Like you're going, because of the lactic acid that starts hitting. And it prevents people from going to true failure, right? Like we were touching on earlier. So would that be a good strategy then? Like, okay, I'm going to get as many reps as I can till that burn hits. Okay, it's not true failure, but now I'm going to pause and let some of that dissipate. I'm going to extend the set out now.
Yeah, now that's an interesting question, because now we're getting into the weeds of, all right, I'm getting more mechanical work than I would have if I just kind of kept going. But the reason why I can't get the mechanical work on the leg extension when I don't pause is for local factors rather than, say, cardiorespiratory fatigue. And this is tough because now we can look at, let's say blood flow restriction training, right? Blood flow restriction training is probably doing something similar to why leg extension hurts so bad. My theory on why leg extension burns so bad in the quads is that in the seated position, as you get a pump, especially with the big quads that all of us...
You're getting pinched off.
Exactly. Yes.
It gets trapped,
Exactly. Right. And I only really kind of came to this conclusion once I started lying back on leg extensions or doing the standing leg extensions.
That same feeling.
And I'm like, well, wow.
Exactly. You got blood flowed out.
Yeah. Well, amazing, right?
Right. Yeah.
So BFR is actually similar to regular resistance training because it's accelerating local failure, right? So because you're not getting adequate ability to clear out metabolites locally within the muscle, not necessarily cardiorespiratory fatigue here, it's inducing failure earlier. So that means that you're exposing more muscle fibers to fatigue because of local factors. Now, an important thing with BFR is that BFR also uses relatively high reps, and the comparisons are often 3 straight sets to your typical 30 to 40, 15, 15, 15. Mm-hmm. So you're accomplishing a lot of work and you're artificially elevating fatigue and therefore requiring artificially more of those high threshold motor units that are normally not active to come to the party earlier. You're effectively reducing your capabilities so that you're getting there earlier, but it is local. So I think in that example of whether should I rest and bang out more reps on leg extension or should I just let that burn happen and just go until I can't, it would probably come out in the wash. The main concern I think people need to have is when they're doing exercises that produce a lot of cardiorespiratory fatigue as well. So if you're doing squats, good mornings, RDL, leg press, some upper body compounds, maybe free weights, where you're huffing and puffing, your heart rate's getting, somewhere around 75, 80, 85% of heart rate max, and you're experiencing that, that burn, that's where I think you could start to run into issues. But for isolation movements, it's just, how much of a masochist are you? And I think probably either way is fine. You could, if you're getting close to failure from the metabolic burn, or each time you get reasonably close to failure, you allow yourself to do more work, you might have to do more work to get as many of those effective reps, quote unquote, versus doing less, kind of like BFR. But it would probably be 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
So maybe based on what you're saying, then if for me, thinking about if I'm going to incorporate, let's say, longer rest periods between reps, it'd be more so from a composure perspective in order to maintain my skill level. So my every single rep I'm still doing is still on the money.
That I really like that perspective, Jeff, because what you're saying is, sure, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, but which one results in me getting more targeted stimulus on the muscle group I want to train?
More efficiency.
So, if you're doing all kinds of antsy-dancy in your pantsy when you're doing your reps because you're pushing close to failure.
Why you talk about Brad like that?
Oh, wow. Now who's talking about Brad? I just meant generally, and then you're going to go call him out. For the record, that was Jeff calling out Brad and pretending that it was Eric.
That's how our relationship, all three of us, like we can do these things. It's nothing but love.
Yes.
That just shows how strong our team is.
That's right. That's throwing Eric under the bus, and then the brotherly love relationship we have. I think I would look at it as how many high quality, high effort reps can I get? And if I'm training through the burn and it produces, 5 iffy reps, or if I can get pretty close to failure and get like 10 across sets, if I preserve my composure, I'd go with the latter every time. Now,
it's not so much the like getting more reps too. It'd be like thinking from a safety component as well. Like I don't want my form to really deviate. Like, because sometimes you're trying to like, people love the burn, right?
That's true.
And they grind and you're like, oh, those reps are getting really ugly. So, you don't want snap city, and not to fear monger, but
no, for
you
sure.
definitely got to think about the safety component as well.
And I think that's why exercise selection comes into play a lot here, and why I favor single joint machine-based movements primarily for a lot of these types of exercises, because if I'm losing my shit in my upper body on a leg extension, I mean, how much can I really deviate? Like if my butt's on the pad and if I touch the bottom of the stack, which I do because the lengthened portion is important, and I get my leg as high as I can, and not worrying about getting all the way up because, that's where I'm getting shorter and shorter in the muscle. And I'm looking like I'm a dancing fool, like with fire ants in my shirt, whatever, right? If I'm huffing and puffing, I'm making noise and I've got headphones on, people are looking at me weird. As long as I'm comfortable being the weirdo, that's probably fine. But if I'm doing that on a barbell row, if I'm doing that on a high rep set of deadlifts, nah, like that's probably not good.
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
Like, we've seen that. So yeah,
absolutely. So I think you want to minimize the potential for the negative effects. So I really like antagonist paired sets primarily on upper body movements, upper body compounds that are machine based, but certainly you can do it on like a seal row bench press. And that's actually, there's research been done on it, as long as you're in good enough cardiovascular shape. I think antagonist peripheral sets or agonist peripheral sets can be good, but you want to make sure that the main movement, if it's something like a squat, a deadlift, a leg press, an RDL, whatever, that the exercise you pair it with is something not super fatiguing. Because when we do see like a squat bench pairing, that's when we start to see some fall off. And I think the fatigue could become problematic as far as execution, like you were saying, Jeff, and even potentially knowing that injury risk is higher when you're fatigued, like you said, not the fear monger, but if all else is equal, I could see that being a slightly higher risk of hurting yourself.
Sure.
Yeah, I find that intra, whatever you want to call it, rep rest really interesting. Because that's something that I had never really dabbled in before until, Jeff kind of introduced me to that. Because I find, at least, anecdotally, kind of my own personal experience, is that oftentimes I can get an extra rep or two, and afterward, like after the set is done, it just quote unquote feels like there was more damage done in a way. So to put kind of a tangible to this, we've been talking about leg extensions, right? If I'm super consistent with my tempo all the way through a set, and I reach failure at say 11, right? I got 10 good repetitions with the same tempo, and the 11th one I could not finish it. It burns, it hurts. Okay, I got 11. It was a good effective set. However, I have played around with trying to extend the set, like at basically rep 8 or 9. At that lengthened portion when the leg extension hits the back, compose myself, give it a 1, 2, 3, 4, go, right? I'm able to instead of failing at 11, it's like, okay, at 11, I managed to finish it, compose myself. 1, 2, 3, go again. The 12th one, I was able to finish it. Now it's really, really, really hurting, and it's really hard to keep my composure. And then the failure rep, even with that bit of composure, 1, 2, 3, 4, go. Now it was 13 that I failed at, right? So I was able to get a couple of, and I guess this is exactly not keeping things short and efficient, but when it was done, I got that extra couple of repetitions, and it, like I said, it just felt, it hurt more. It was more invasive, it felt more effective. So I find that intra rep rest, at least right now anyways, vastly interesting. And I'm searching for ways to learn about it.
So the question is, it felt like it was more worthwhile, but that was the question to Eric was, is it
exactly
more worthwhile? Because if there's like strong evidence that says maybe not so much, or it's about the same, it's like, well, do I need to grind myself for 2, 3 more
Brad's a
reps?
wimp. He's going to give up on it. I'm going to say, I'm just going to go to 11, fail, call it good.
Yeah. The kind of unifying principle between all this stuff, and I'll even explain one more study, which I think is useful because it's topical to what we just talked about, is that if you're able to get similar or greater mechanical work, and there's a similar, maybe average across time proximity to failure, or you're training with a reasonably heavy load and proximity to failure becomes less important, it's probably a win, especially if you can save time. That's another win. But if what you're doing saves time, but you see big drops off in total performance or total volume, or to take it all the way to the extreme of cluster sets, like you do similar volume, but you're able to reduce the proximity to failure pretty substantially, that might be great for power development, thinking specificity. I can maintain a higher rep speed, but I'm not actually getting those rep speeds to slow down enough due to local actual muscle fatigue and, high tension development that would occur from that. So maybe not great for hypertrophy. So I think if we can understand those big picture principles, then we can understand when we want to use this for a power lifter or for, say, a bodybuilder. Now, here's an example, like kind of what we were talking about. There's a pretty cool study that's currently pre-printed. So it hasn't been peer-reviewed yet, but it will be probably soon and be fully published. We've talked about like I think what's colloquially called lengthened supersets. So like, let's say you're doing leg curls, and each time you're trying to touch your heel to your butt, and then you're like, I could get another 5 reps if I just brought it up 3/4 of the way, and then half of the way, then 1/3 of the way, then pulsed, and then I can't move and I'm done. That has now actually been studied, and I think this is really relevant on things like leg curls, or things like dumbbell lateral raises, right? Or things like cable rows, or any row or pull down.
Mm-hmm.
So what they did is they used this on calf raises. And what they did was, I think they had Smith machine calf raises, and they had a group that did 3 to 4 sets of standing Smith machine calf raises. One of the calves was randomly allocated to one condition and the other. So they did sets to momentary failure, so training to the point where they can no longer get another rep. And then one of the calves did partial repetitions in the lengthened position. So they decided basically, after you get all the full range reps, now we're going to set a new standard for what is considered a quote unquote partial rep, a lengthened partial. And I think it was like maybe 1/3 of the way or half of the way or something like that. And you don't actually get to stop until you get those reps as well.
That's it.
So this is just essentially extending the set and letting range of motion come down instead of, say, having load come down in a drop set, or having reps come down as in a rest pause. Now it's just keep going.
Same load, as many full range of motion reps as you can, and let fatigue just basically take you to, you just can't move this thing anymore.
Exactly. Or some partial range of motion that you set.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And once again, unsurprisingly, we saw greater hypertrophy in the group that extended those sets. And this is another potential time-saving strategy if you want. Like you don't have time to maybe do another exercise, so just bang it out. And there are some creative applications to this. So something that Berto got me doing, because he wanted to see more upper back development, and my upper back is one of the things that seems to have grown pretty well in this last block, was after all of the rows that I'm doing, he wanted me to just do scapular shrugs. And I found something really interesting because I train with a workout partner, Matt. Shout out to Matt Cross, Dr. Matt Cross. So when we both do the same type of row, like let's say a chest supported row here or a chest supported row here, or even a cable row, and then we lean back, I can bang out more reps with the shrugs than I got on the row by like 1 or 2. So if I do, let's say 10 reps to failure on a chest supported row here, and then I shrug, I can get like 12. He can get like 5 or 6. So to me, that tells me that we have different things or different muscles that are the limiting factor on those performances. Like my arms are growing really well right now. I don't think it's just because of the arm work I'm doing. My arms have always seemed to grow when I do more upper body work. So for me, perhaps the limiting factor is a little more arm dominant when I'm doing rows. And for him, those rows might be targeting his mid-back from the get-go. They don't have much left. So that is a really interesting individualized application of this to where I'm doing essentially lengthened partials, like not even the portion where I'm building my elbow on a row. And that for some people can be potentially a game changer. If you think about it, we think about the movement RIR, but what is my rhomboid? What is my mid-trap? What is my
versus
lat
your
RIR?
bicep and your
Exactly.
brachialis and all those arm muscles,
It's not hitting close enough to failure.
Right.
With that movement pattern or that range of motion.
So, and when I have successfully brought up my back at times, I've had to be kind of creative with exercise selection and do more work and train to failure. And that starts to make sense to me, you know? So sometimes, you know, when we talk about like the science, it's great, but we have to think about like, what are you experiencing? And some of the things that I like to ask people is like, what do you feel is the limiting muscle in a compound movement that is like, when you fail, is that muscle failing? Right? So one of the reasons why I really like say pendulum squats or wedge foot elevated leaning back Smith machine squats is when you're doing like a back squat, you know, you see it every single time, almost everybody, and there's no avoiding this. It's not a problem to be fixed, to be clear. You watch people go from their first to third attempt, they generally see more hips back shifting. Because they're moving to a position where, okay, my quads, I can't maintain
Can't do it anymore.
this shape and complete a squat without more involvement of my glutes and hams and lower back. So I'm going to do that. And that's fine. That's just the way we squat more, right? But if our goal as a bodybuilder is to develop our quads, and that's the reason why we're primarily doing this movement, and we'll take a little bit of, you know, lower back, glute and ham involvement, that's fine, a little bit extra credit. We don't want to get to the position where we're just shifting to our strongest position, and now we kind of can
no
perpetuate.
longer training what we're trying to grow. Yeah,
exactly. You know, you can have someone kind of perpetuate a dominant muscle group rather than correct it. So, you know, trying to kind of keep a certain body position, or maybe going, that's not the best exercise. Sure, everybody loves squats, but for me, maybe I need to do some, you know, low foot position leg press, or I need to do a Bulgarian split squat, or I need to do a single leg, you know, squat pattern or something like that, so that I can keep that muscle group to the fire, quote unquote. So anyway, I went all around there, but there is some data to indicate extending a set with whether it's a partial in a lengthened position, whether it is or interset rest so you can bang out more quality repetitions, great point on that, or whether I'm reducing load so I can keep getting reps, so long as the mechanical work that I'm doing is similar or greater, that I'm saving time and I'm getting close to true muscular failure for local reasons rather than cardiorespiratory reasons, it's a potential win.
Wow, my ears are kind of smoking a little bit. all of the coaching implications that I've learned here are going to be downloaded onto the athletes that I coach pretty frequently. So yeah, I appreciate all the knowledge drops there, Eric.
Well, it's an interesting thing because there's been a lot of research that's come out recently, and I've kind of had to really wrap my head around it to see where these lines of connections are to get kind of a full understanding. Like there's been recent stuff, like there was a pretty cool study where they compared rest pause to drop sets to straight sets. and they manipulated the load and the reps and the number of sets and the rest periods so that all three groups got the same volume, and all three groups trained to in past failure. They actually got light spots to complete everything. And lo and behold, there was no significant differences in hypertrophy. So it just kind of like these things keep reinforcing that we probably shouldn't see rest, pause, drop sets as these totally separate concepts, but rather we're trying to find that sweet spot between time efficiency and stimulus efficiency. And if we sacrifice in either direction too much, like if we just rest 5 minutes between everything, we're just unable to complete a high volume if that's the goal, right? Maybe if you're doing low volume training, then absolutely rest a lot. But if we sacrifice too far the other way, the fatigue gets so high that the stimulus efficiency drops so much that we're not gaining anything on the time savings.
I think it's cool. It's empowering because I know sometimes science has been taking a hit as of late, but you can see how it just broadens the toolbox. And it comes down to like, okay, the more tools we have, I can actually use a certain tool for a specific job at hand based on someone's context.
Yes.
And it's a question I get over the 38 years of training is a lot of years to be in the gym. And it's like, what has worked? The always question is what's best? What's been the best for you? It's like all of it, depending on the context.
Yeah. Yeah, I think people need to be open-minded to science, but they don't want to be blinded by science or treat it like a gospel or just, you need to you have to think about it, right? Because it's so divorced, depending upon the study design, it can be to some degree divorced a little bit if it's translational research, or extremely divorced from practice if it's like, a petri dish stuff. So if you don't have the ability to integrate it to practice and conceptually understand what it means, you can do dumb things with it and just have these very black and white answers and start to ignore common sense. Like, you don't want to have your mind so open to science that your brain falls out, as the typical saying goes, right? Like, it makes a lot of sense. Like, oh, okay, when would a drop set, a rest pause, short rest interval, partials, et cetera, be beneficial? Well, if I'm doing more work and if I'm getting more high quality repetitions for the target muscle group, that's probably going to be better. And when I'm getting less work, or the reps composure is really poor, or my total number of high proximity to failure or close to failure reps is lower, that's probably not beneficial. So yeah, what's your goal? Are you trying to save time? Is that your primary thing? Or are you trying to increase the stimulus per unit of time? Or are you trying to get the best of both worlds in that trade-off, like an antagonist paired set? That's when you can start to take these tools and understand how they work. But I think when people just see the tool as good or bad, rather than for the right purpose, they go, oh, a screw, I'm gonna get out my good hammer, so.
Or that screwdriver is very bad.
Yes, it's a bad screwdriver.
Yeah, because it's got the 4 prongs instead of the 2,
Yeah, Phillips heads are bad. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
Did we do it, gentlemen?
I think we covered it all. Covered a lot.
Yeah, like I said, my ears are smoking, so.
Well, folks, I am so privileged and pleasured. I'm pleasured. Wow. Sometimes I get too excited about science and coaching and bodybuilding, folks. But yeah, I'll just stick with privileged and honored is actually what I meant to say. To have the pleasure of talking with you two coaches with your wealth of knowledge, wealth of experience. I've learned tremendously from you guys over the years, and I hope that us learning together here has been helpful to you, dear listeners. So thank you, 3DMJers, and we'll catch you next time on the next episode of the 3DMJ podcast.